Semi-formally again, my name is Maggi Leung. I'm in the Governance and Inclusive Development Group in the Department of Human Geography, Planning and IDS at the UvA in Amsterdam. I was just saying that I got so excited. I actually have prepared, of course, a little note, but since I don't have my glasses, I can't read, so I'm just going to do it organically now. Most important is to welcome everyone. Very happy that you've made your way here to Amsterdam. Today is a very special day, it's 8th of March. There are a lot of other activities going on because it's International Women's Day. Of course, it's good to have the day to recognize achievements, to recognize challenges, how much work we still have to do on that front. My personal wish is that we don't need such a day anymore. Very soon, we don't need to have one day to think about the women anymore. But that's not the reason why we have staged this seemingly competitive program. So we wanted to do something like this. Not a conference, but a time when lots of colleagues, young and old, new and more experienced, to come together to talk about what is international development studies about, where should it be going. We don't want to make a big conference, but we call it a forum. So that is also something that we choose purposefully to make sure that, and I think we started quite well. Lunch was already very interesting. Oh, my eyes are coming.
Look at you.
Thank you, Yuri.
There you go.
Thank you. But now I realize I can do it without seeing, so.
Okay.
Wow, that was a shock, because without this it would be a problem. But I just want to go back that, we chose to do this forum in March because we were thinking it's springtime, we're looking to the future, and for those of you who might be spending a few more days in Amsterdam, it's a nice time to be here. The temperature is a bit low for springtime, but we do see some flowers. Yeah. Also because today is 8th of March, I think some of you might say, oh, tonight, I know that tonight there are also events. My student, for example, she said, oh, she needs to go to an event. I'm especially grateful, therefore, that you have made time for us. I have to send apologies from Joyeeta Gupta, my co-chair, my colleague, my office mate. Of course, this conference was organized also with her. She was actually the first driving force to say, let's do a conference, and then we sort of counter a bit and say, oh, Joyeeta, let's not do a big conference, but we do a smaller forum. She is expecting a rather major operation, and therefore she cannot be here today, and she sent her apologies. But she will see you, or we will see her, in a recorded manner very soon. I also wanted to say a little bit about the topic, why just international development? Sound like a sport brand, just do it or just not do it. Just a little bit about where we got the idea from. I joined the group actually only a little bit more than a year ago. And there have been many nice moments, and one of the nicest moments we had were in the summer before the term started. It now feels like a million years ago. We spent 1.5 days together at a retreat, kind of. And here I only copied the fun photos. So we played some games, we talked, but we also very creatively thought about, of course, our discipline and what is important, what we need to do more. And at the end, we made a list, and the very top thing that everybody, actually, I think everybody thought important is the notion of justice, or the injustice, And we were thinking about, are we actually as a collective doing enough to understand justice, injustice issues in the different terrains? Of course, when we development studies, we work on many different topics in many contexts. And therefore, we then decided to devote today, the coming 2 days basically, on the notion of justice. We've decided also a more bottom-up co-creative format. So tomorrow we will have 6 panels organized by colleagues who wanted to pursue their ideas. And we did a little bit of a selection, of course, we had to. And therefore, it's a little bit out of my hand, our hands then, how things go. I'm sure it will be very good. So, And I think that's all from my introduction. You'll be meeting my colleagues at the GID group, over the 2 days. So I won't introduce one after another. We'll just get to know each other in an organic way, I think, in the next couple of days. Now I would like to invite, I'm very honored that our Dean, Agneta Fischer, is here to say a few words just I said, maybe nice if she comes and welcome our guests, also see what we plan to do here. She's very busy today also because of this International Women's Day and whatever honorary work she has to do, of course. Agneta, would you like to take the stage for the next few minutes to say a few words? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Yes, I want to. I think this was what Maggie called the informal welcome, and I am the more formal welcome, although I don't know whether it's very formal. But anyhow, I am indeed the Dean of the Faculty, and this is organized by one of the many research groups in the faculty. And so I actually feel very honored to welcome you, because the UvA, the University of Amsterdam, and within the University of Amsterdam, the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences and the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research is, of course, very honored and very proud to have this conference here, to host this conference. It's not only hosting, because a conference is also not a conference, I should say a forum. But it's not a coincidence, of course, that you are here, because the GID is a very active group with researchers and students who are all very committed to this topic. And so I think it's very good that you organize it. Also because I think it is maybe about time to do something else than conferences and giving talks and listening, giving talks and listening, and then some sort of debate sometimes. But I think this is a very interesting idea to have a forum like this, a scientific forum or a scholarly forum or whatever you would call it. So thank you very much for organizing this, all of you, all of the people who have been engaged in this. Regarding the topic, so if we talk about just international development, I thought first just international development, just international development. I would actually say fair international development, but that is, I think, the same concept. And it fits very well into the research that we do within the faculty and also within the university. So there are several topics that are university broad being studied and actually emphasized, which is sustainability on the one hand and fair and resilient societies on the other hand. So that very much fits into this topic. And so we are within the faculty doing all kinds of research related to mobility, to women's voices, gender and violence, conflict, inequality, you name it, all related to fairness, justice, whatever you would call it. In addition to trying to entangle the causes of these types of problems, we also try to contribute to the debate to solve it, or to solve it is maybe a big word, but trying to contribute at least to the debate about that. So this conference is actually in the heart of the research program of many different groups in the faculty. And so I would say I warmly welcome, therefore, all of you, and I hope that this very innovative format will bring us a little bit further than only listening to talks. So have a very good forum, I would say. And I hope you will enjoy this and maybe Amsterdam also a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I would like to actually sit back and relax and pass the torch to Karen. She will be moderating our first opening panel, and she will explain to you and remind the speakers what the panel is about. But before we invite the panelists who are here to come on stage to sit on the sofa, we will play 2 short videos so that the speakers can also watch the 2 videos. I will pass the mic to you now and keep quiet. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome to our Just ID forum. My name is Paiva Henrique. For those who don't know me, I am an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Planning and International Development Studies, and I have been tasked with moderating the first panel for our forum. So before we start, I do have some notes because I cannot forget some important things. Before we start this panel, we would like to let you all know that we have 2 wonderful journalism students who are preparing a harvest film for our forum, which we are going to show on Friday, which means they are going to be around filming things, thank you very much, taking pictures, doing some quick short interviews. If you do not want to be filmed, please approach us. Approach them, approach Maggie, Kraylis, or myself. That's absolutely okay. If you're not comfortable with that, just let us know, and we are not going to include you in the film. This is not going to be broadly advertised, but it is something that might be in our website. So just so you know that. I do have the privilege to introduce our wonderful lineup of speakers today. All of our panelists have made important and extensive contributions to the field of international development, which means that because we have very short time for this panel, I will have to keep introductions short, so I might not do justice to all of their achievements and all of their contributions, so I apologize in advance for that, and please feel free to add details if I have missed important details about your career and everything you have done. Prior to today's event, our panelists have been asked to share their views regarding injustice, justice and injustice in development studies, research and practices. This panel was asked specifically to reflect on challenges of international development, of doing, of thinking, of practicing, researching, examining development studies. So the hope is that that's going to pave the way for the discussions we are going to have in the upcoming days. We are very much looking forward to hear how they have addressed this prompt. And we would like to start with a video by Joyeeta Gupta, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, but she's certainly here in spirit and in content. Joyeeta is professor.
Hello everyone.
She can't wait to join our group. Joyeeta is professor of environment and development in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam and the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. And she also leads our program on governance and inclusive development, which I'm a part of as well, and Maggie as well. Joyeeta's contribution has been extensive, both in development research and in development practice. Her work focuses on the need to phase out fossil fuels in an equitable manner. We have actually an entire session organized on that, very much looking forward to that. The influence of changing geopolitics and governance patterns on North and South, environment and development issues, and promoting sustainable development through integration, coherence, and mainstreaming. Joyeeta is also co-chair of the Earth Commission, set up by the Future Earth and supported by the Global Challenges Foundation. So let's hear what Joyeeta has to say.
Hello everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about international development, Earth system boundaries, and Earth system justice. Basically, my narrative is that Earth system boundaries and standards imply a shrinking ecospace within which development can occur. Now, living within the shrinking ecospace implies that we need to share the space. Therefore, a new justice narrative is needed. Now, the classic governance approaches to a shrinking ecospace tends to exacerbate injustice and hence an earth system justice approach is urgently needed. And finally, without such justice, living within the ecospace will not be possible. Now, if I look at the demand for environmental utilization space, it is growing, while the supply of the space is declining. Now, how do we define this space? One can look at it in terms of the fixed land and freshwater supplies that we have in society. It's in relation to the fact that strategic minerals and metals are declining rapidly, that even though we have enough fossil fuels, there is a very strong need for us to leave more than 80% of these fossil fuels underground to achieve the 1.5 degree centigrade target, that there are ambient and other standards for land, water, air worldwide that are being crossed every single day, and beyond that there are earth system boundaries that we are crossing. Our justice narrative implies taking into account the 3 I's: interspecies justice and earth system stability, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. And we try to balance between these 3 elements. We then look at the ends of justice and the means of justice. In terms of the ends, we try to understand, are the safe boundaries just? And we also try to look at, can we meet minimum needs of all people within these safe and just boundaries? In terms of means, we look at, can we allocate the remaining resources in a just manner? How is risk distributed in society and harm distributed? And finally, how are responsibilities distributed? The justice scholarship ranges from the local contextual to the global universal on the one hand, and on the other hand, from incremental conservative approaches to ideal transformative approaches. And a lot of the literature, of course, discusses what's important from a local perspective. In the context of boundaries, we find that when there is a shrinking ecospace, neoliberal capitalist responses focus on pricing these resources, on ensuring that there are markets and contracts. And this basically, in our view, is a conservative response which exacerbates injustice. Another conservative response is when states decide to adopt a hegemonic approach in which they do not wish to share resources with other countries, and they focus on the idea of full permanent sovereignty or securitization of resources. A third possible way to deal with these shrinking resources is to recognize polycentric approaches, and while this is very, very useful in terms of experimentation with ideas, this approach does not really help to distribute resources. Perhaps there is some possibility in the idea of global constitutionalism, where we try to look at how and which principles can enable us to decide how resources will be shared between different actors. Our justice storyline basically is on the right side of the quadrants presented here, and we believe that it's multi-level in nature, going from local to global and back to local. And this multi-level nature is absolutely essential dealing with justice. Now, when you have a shrinking ecospace, our idea of substantive justice is that there must be some degree of access to minimum needs and rights of people, and then we need to discuss the allocation of the remaining resources, risks, and responsibilities in society. One of our recent papers, authored by Rummels et al., basically argues that if in 2018 we would have liked to provide every human being on Earth a minimum access level 1 or a minimum access level 2, then we would have probably crossed the boundaries of the Earth system. And therefore, we would require massive transformation in addition to technology development in order to ensure that meeting these minimum needs occurs within the boundaries. Now, in other words, we are arguing that it's impossible to achieve just access without just allocation. There are a number of reasons for that. First, vulnerability and poverty is not innate. It is created by our institutions. Secondly, when you allow markets to allocate resources, the price goes up, making it unaffordable for the poor, as well as for those states who want to subsidize the poor. Moreover, resource extraction tends to exploit countries with poorer laws. We find that certification schemes tend to exclude the poor. Markets, in combination with perverse subsidies in the north, lead to exploitation in the south. We see that wastes are being dumped from the global north on the global south. Assets managers are exploiting the south, and shrinking assets stranding assets are also increasingly being dumped on the global south. Now, aid and philanthropy may finance access, but through export credit and investment strategies, they actually bankroll pollution. And of course, if you talk about procedural justice, remember that procedural justice can also be misused to marginalize or silence the poor. I now bring together the ingredients of our justice narrative. Basically, we are focusing on ideal transformative justice that builds on epistemic and recognition justice. It focuses on 3 I's of justice: intergenerational justice, intragenerational justice, interspecies, and earth system stability. It focuses on procedural justice, but such procedural justice should not aim at maintaining the status quo, but should also try to ensure that there is changes in the status quo. Otherwise, we cannot transform society. And in terms of our substantive justice, we look at access and allocation of the remaining resources, risks, and responsibilities in society. These are the elements of our justice narrative, and then we try to operationalize this in terms of trying to identify safe and just boundaries, as well as trying to identify what would be the minimum needs of people worldwide that must be met. In terms of allocation, we then try to look at what are the underlying driving forces that cause both environmental degradation as well as vulnerability, and how can we address this. And at the same time, we try to look at what are the possibilities for liability for harm that is caused, for setting consumption ceilings for people's behavior. And at the same time, we try to look at what kind of allocation mechanisms would be aligned with a justice narrative. If we move, in applying these ideas to water, we then look at how do we share water between humans and with nature. And this has to happen both at global level, transboundary level, national level, as well as local level, and these are all interlinked. In terms of sharing with nature, how do we create reserves and wetlands? How do we ensure that there are drawdown restrictions on groundwater and minimum flow for surface water? In terms of the narrative regarding local sharing, how do we combine a centralized approach with a decentralized approach in a way that we can actually share water between the various users and users of water, as well as ensure that there is no harm caused. At the transboundary level, we are also looking at how do we equitably and optimally utilize transboundary rivers in accordance with the UN Watercourses Convention. How do we ensure that there is no significant harm to neighboring countries, and how do we ensure the territorial integrity of countries? And at the global level, we're really talking about how do we integrate justice issues into the trade in water, justice issues in the trade in virtual water, as well as how do we integrate justice issues in the investment in all activities that actually use water. Climate justice issues are manifold. First, is the 2-degree or 1.5 degree target just enough? We argue that 1 degree is more just than 1.5. If you have a certain temperature target, then what does it mean in terms of the budgets of countries to emit greenhouse gases, and have this been equitably shared between countries? Are the market instruments used in the climate negotiations, are they actually exacerbating injustice, or are they in fact promoting efficiency? And how are we going to deal with the justice issues involved in the fact that more than 80% of the remaining fossil fuels are in the global south and they will be left with stranded assets. And what happens to the impacts of climate change that are currently being caused? Who is going to pay for it? And finally, if our focus on GDP is the underlying driver of the climate change problem, how are we going to decide who has the right to develop and how? And all this brings me to my conclusion that if we want to live within these boundaries and standards, this is not possible without an Earth system justice approach. And this Earth system justice approach is not only needed because of legal reasons such as human rights or political reasons such as the consensus in the 2030 agenda. There are also substantive reasons, even if negative, that we need it. First, the other half is being harmed because millions of people are dying or are exposed to all kinds of ecological damage, which is causing them loss and damage. And this requires us to take responsibility. The second is you cannot exclude the other half from using their resources. If 80% of the fossil fuels that remain are in the global south, how are we going to force them not to use that? If 10 out of 12 biodiversity-rich domains are in the global south, how are we going to ever manage to convince them not to damage these resources if they see that as necessary from their perspective? So in a sense, I'm arguing that if we do not go for a just approach, we cannot live within these boundaries. I conclude that Garrett Hardin's argument that those in the lifeboat should not help those outside is a flawed argument. If we do not adopt a justice approach, we will all lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyeeta, for this wonderful start to our panel and for reminding us of how justice is central to ensuring everyone's futures. So now I would like to welcome the second panelist, who's also joining via video.
It's the last one.
It's the last one. Unfortunately, Alfredo Saad-Filho could not be here with us today, but he's also sent a video to us. I'm going to quickly introduce him. Alfredo is Professor of Political Economy and International Development in the Department of International Development at King's College London. His academic publications include, of course, many books, articles, and reports that range across critiques of the post-Washington consensus, International Monetary Fund and World Bank policies on pro-poor policy alternatives. His writings also include concrete analysis of fiscal, monetary, financial, balance of payments and employment policies, as well as inflation targeting, resource use, and policy making in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, particularly Brazil, and the Middle East. So let's hear what Alfredo has shared with us.
Hello everyone, I am very sorry that I cannot be at the session together with you, but I wish to participate indirectly through this short video. My name is Alfredo Saad-Filho. I teach at King's College London. I would like to make a very quick reflection about the state of development studies today. The most important aspect of development studies today, in my view, is that we live in a time of crisis. So the process of development currently is a process of confronting systematic, systemic, repeated, converging, overlapping crises. Crises in the economic domain. In the economic domain, where the core of the operations of social reproduction take place. The economy determines the possibilities of well-being for large numbers of people in the global south. This is one thing that needs to be confronted, the crisis in the economy. The other crisis that needs to be confronted is the political crisis of democracy that we experience today across the world, not only in developing countries, not only the countries of the global south, but also in many countries in the global north. Democracies that we thought, that we were told that we were reassured were stable democracies now crumble in front of us. Look at what's happening in the United States, look at what's happening in the UK. Democracies in crises in the countries in the global core, and they have much more frequently been in crisis in the global south, but now the global south feels the hit from this instability in the global north, political instability in the global north, and it's being dragged along and it is suffering impacts. Examples of India, Turkey, Brazil, until very recently under Jair Bolsonaro, the Philippines, and a whole number of other countries in the global south. The third crisis that is confronting the global south is the health crisis. We all saw how the global pandemic of COVID-19 affected countries all around the world. We all saw the differential impact of the pandemic, particularly importantly for our purposes, the ways in which the global north hogged personal protective equipment and later vaccines for their own protection and basically abandoned the global south, cut them loose with whatever consequences in order to shelter populations in the global north, regardless of the political disasters of pandemic policy and health policy across the global north. They basically abandoned has to deal with the consequences of the health crisis that are very different from the consequences of the health crisis in the global north in the fine-grained. The fourth significant crisis that has to be examined and that will shape development studies in the coming years is evidently the crisis of the environment driven by climate change, with all the implications that this will have for food provision, water provision, well-being, security of housing, etc. Across these four areas, and we could discuss each of them in great detail, across these four areas, this is where I feel development studies needs to be mobilized. We need to pay attention to, we need to focus our energies into the study of, and we need to confront these challenges also in the realm of activism, our political participation, our political contribution to addressing these issues, both in the global north and in the global south. I would focus on our time as a time of crisis, and I would focus our energies in addressing those crises in ways that are progressive, in ways that build citizenship, in ways that build optimism and hope in the possibility of resolution. But the possibility of resolution of these crises, it has to be framed around feasible goals and deep and detailed interpretations. And these have to be anchored by an understanding of our common citizenship and the search for alternatives that include people, that bring them together, that are progressive in the sense of being compatible with improved distributions of income, wealth, and power. This is where I would focus my analysis of development in the current period and in the time to come. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. It's a shame that he could not be here, but it's wonderful to hear that yes, right, we do, I mean, that's not the so wonderful part, we do live in a time of multiple simultaneous compounding crises, but if we unite around solidarity and justice, we might find a path forward. So maybe something that we can pick up in the discussion session as well. So now I would like to invite our in-person panelists to join me in our kind of living room setup to continue this panel. Annelies Zoomers, please join us, Henning Melber and Murat Arsel. Please be careful as you approach our stage, as it is not absolutely stable. But I mean, I don't know. It's not even, yeah, it's not even, that's a better. So the way the panel is going to work, again, I'm going to give short introductions, and apologies for missing details. Please feel free to add to my introduction. And then each panelist will have 10 minutes to respond to our prompt. Maybe Maggie can help with keeping time, just so we are within the 10 minutes for each panelist. Welcome to our forum living room. Kind of like this concept now, so I'm going to run with it. Annelies, if you don't mind being first. Annelies is Professor of International Development Studies at Utrecht University and is the co-founder of the Netherlands Land Academy and founding chair of Shared Value Foundation. Her work investigates new ways to simultaneously contribute to the revitalization of shrinking areas in Europe, while also offering space for the successful integration of non-EU migrants. Annelies is also actively engaged in consortium building and setting up learning networks related to various topics, including people-centered and context-sensitive approaches in delta planning and large-scale land investments currently taking place in various African countries. Thank you, Annelies, for joining us.
It's now up to me to start talking. Do you want me to stand? Maybe it's better, because then I become more active and more convincing. First of all, thank you for... Do you mind if I step down?
Not at all.
No? Because that is safer. Yeah? Thanks very much for organizing this event. I think nice to have this crowd, because it's very old-fashioned indeed, to bring together groups that work in the same discipline, and we have to cross boundaries all the time, but so good to be back into our own family. I have a short talk, but in spite of only having 10 minutes, I decided to split in 3. And the first part is looking back. I'm old enough to be able to talk about history a little bit, and I find that important to contextualize what we are talking about. Then the second part is about now, and the third part is, well, obviously about the future. First, looking back, because when you ask me, okay, do a short pitch about well, justice, etc., in relation to development studies, how to move in the direction of a more just society. Of course, we are not the first generation trying to do that. And as you know, and I'm very much from a development studies background, we started after the war. I was not born by then. But by then, speaking about justice and how to make society better, it was by then, of course, all about achieving progress, modernization, etc. And later on, it became clear that it was not only a matter of growth, it was also acknowledged that you might be, you need also some redistribution. It was the time of the land reforms, etc. And so that was a very conventional start, about thinking about what development is about, what just development is about. After that, and then we moved from the 50s, 60s to the 70s, 80s, there was a more radical approach. There was a much more critical approach of capitalism. It was a period where we started to think about dependencia, the fact that capitalism was not the solution, but was the cause of inequalities and poverty, etc. So that was an important period to think about what justice is about, and of course think about also the theories, post-development theories, etc. Arturo Escobar, who saw indeed thought much more in terms of anti-development. Development was unjust by definition. It came from northern, western hegemonic thinking. So after that, the more radical, what happened afterwards is that there was a period in which many people thought that the solution was more in development projects. That was the time of structural adjustment. And then, for example, UNICEF started to publish about adjustment with the human face. So by then, the idea was, okay, if we focus on those people who are bypassed, that is the way to move forward, to move into the direction of a more just society. And after that, and I think then I came in the picture myself, it was more moving in the direction. There was a crisis in development thinking when at least we started at Utrecht University. Projects were also not the way forward. It was just gap filling, etc. But then globalization took over, and in the context of globalization debates, there were people who thought that globalization would bring a lot of new opportunities. Globalization would be a ladder of people to climb out of poverty, etc. Even though that you had other groups who saw globalization as snakes that created new inequalities. But I think, so giving this overview, and I would like to also add in that context, of course, it is very neoliberal, the context in which we operated. It was very much about good governance as a kind of solution, transparencies, etc. But and then finally we ended up with the SDGs. Of course, this is a kind of helicopter view, but I find it important to show how dynamic thinking has been. And whereas we were thinking, the world kept developing as if there is no, the researchers do their thing, but at the same time, of course, the world changed very much because we had the rapid the rise of the BRICS. So there was indeed China and Brazil, of course, much more other actors trying to bring new development, introducing also alternative ideas, and simultaneously you see a huge increase in capital flows. So whereas we were talking within academia, the world was taken away with billions of dollars being invested in all kinds of things. So that's a little bit the kind of stage that I would like to paint. That brings me to the second part of my talk, which is about now. And last week I met with our bachelor students and I said, well, I think that we are in a very confusing time at this moment, because we talk about justice and new inequalities, etc. But the first thing that is currently happening, and it's not new, but it is happening over the final 5 years, let's put it like that, human development is not so central in the agenda anymore. Development discussions have been overshadowed to a large extent by discussions about sustainability discussions. Sustainable transformation, or the transformation, and sustainability transformation or transition is very high on the agenda, and we are now a little bit in the shadow, in the sense of nowadays being surrounded by all kinds of other people who also analyze issues of development, inequality, but very much from a perspective of Earth, planetary issues, etc. And they are so strong in setting the agenda, and that it translates easily in all kinds of top-down projects, etc., that are being implemented, and it is all for the sake of saving our planet, etc. So that is one thing that sometimes makes me a little bit confused. So if that is the case, then should we then accept that planet is more important than the situation and the well-being of people? Then the second thing that I'm very worried about and also confused about is the enormous Eurocentrism that we are living in. We are at an age, and even if we look back, I think I cannot remember that there was another time in which we heard and talked so little about things that were happening in the rest of the world when it comes to food problems, famines, etc. It is in the news, but it is in one way or another not so prominent in our debates anymore. To the extent that we discuss world issues, it is very much from our own perspective, and not maybe in this crowd so much, but thinking about policies, debates, also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are so engaged with ourselves, our business, our COVID, our future, etc. So I'm worried about that. I am afraid that that did not happen before the same way. And maybe at the same time, also very strange for me is to find out that the knowledge that we have been generated about development and poverty and how to deal with vulnerabilities are certainly also at home in our own country. And so that sounds a little bit maybe controversial because I say we are Eurocentric, but I also now realize that all those issues that I have been studying elsewhere, farmers' protests, land conflicts, housing problems, climate change, extremes, floods, etc. They are in our own environment, and maybe the worst part of that is also the lack of trust in our own government. It was mentioned before, the crisis in democracy, etc. And so it's a kind of confusing thing for myself. Well, what is my position then? Maybe it's time to learn from the South. Rather than going myself there. Also, given the fact that I have so many colleagues now abroad who live there, so there are other also modalities to collaborate. So maybe my future is more to apply the knowledge and think about issues of justice, etc., also related to our own environment. Then finally, also a final thing why I'm confused has to do with deep globalization, because until now it was all globalization and the interconnectedness, but nowadays we are living at a moment where deglobalization is the issue, etc. Well, then finally, and it's not on purpose that I stand with the back to you, because I respect you as a timekeeper, the future and the position, our field of studies. What kind of priorities do I see, and what is the value of the type of knowledge that we have to offer? First of all, I see it as an obligation, an old-fashioned obligation, to remind policymakers and our students, etc., that we are not center stage. The Netherlands, Europe, in spite of the fact that we are more and more withdrawing from the rest of the world, we are not alone. And I think it is very important to keep having a very open approach, use our studies to show what's happening in other places as well, and in particular also to better understand issues of interconnectedness. We are now in the Netherlands and Europe working on a sustainable future, a lot of funding about the Green Deal, etc. But what do our investments here, but also there, but let's focus then on the things that we do here, what are the implications for other places? And of course there are many examples that our electric car have implications for the intensity of mining in other places of the world. And so the interconnectedness thinking is very important. I see that as something related to development studies. We have to systematically analyze all the things that are happening here with respect to things that are happening there, on top of having an obligation to keep using our research and our collaboration and to enforce our governments not to become blind for what's happening in other places. Then the second important thing for the future is, I think, I feel obligation to again put people center stage, because it is indeed about planetary futures that we find a sustainable future. And in those debates, to the extent that reference is made to communities, it is always, okay, we also we make a project and then we make sure that the community will benefit. But based on our knowledge, we know that any intervention will by definition have multiple impacts, and there is not one community. There are diverse communities with different interests, etc. So that means that by definition, everything that we do will produce some benefits from some, but for others, they will lose. So we have to enforce ourselves how to deal with those who lose, and then it is no longer enough to talk about compensation. So the discussions nowadays about development are so narrow. So if the case is that any intervention will have implications for people, what is then the range of implications and how to deal with the situation that there will always people that will be bypassed, etc. So diversity is very important. And then finally, of course, for a long time we proudly referred to Amartya Sen when it came to the definition of what development is about. What is development? And we were already used to that situation that we don't label what development is about. Development is defined from the perspective of people. And that is how it used to be defined, and the objective of development was formulated as, okay, take care of, make sure that people can have the life that they value and aspire. Well, given the situation that we are in, that is of course nowadays very oversimplification, because we cannot afford to have the life we aspire, because there are limitations. We are aware of that. And we also know it's not only about justice from a human perspective. Also at Utrecht University, there's a lot of discussion about not only human rights, but also rights for nature, rights for animals, etc. So within development studies, we have to rethink a little bit what development is about, and to broaden that human perspective, so that also those other dimensions are taken into account. And thinking about development, maybe it's less than we used to think of about well-being. Maybe it is much more about making sure that people have a capacity to deal with extremes on the one hand, and maybe helping people to anticipate unexpected events. And so the resilience of livelihoods might be relatively more important nowadays than it used to be. Well, I could keep talking. There are other things that I could say, but I think I gave some ideas and hopefully useful input for the discussion. And thanks again, Maggie, for bringing us here. Yeah?
Thank you, Annelies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annelies, for this historical overview. It's wonderful, right? Thinking, crisis versus development, crisis through development, crisis in development. And I think we are very much in a moment of reconceiving development, and how can we do that from other perspectives. So thank you so much. I will move on to our next panelist, Henning Melber, and invite you to respond to our prompt as well. Henning is president of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, an extraordinary professor at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, and the Center for Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Henning has published numerous books and several other contributions on topical issues including Namibia, Southern Africa, liberation movements as governments, German colonialism, racism, global governance and asymmetric power relations, and African middle classes. He is also proud to be classified as scholar activist and public intellectual in his commitments to social justice. So welcome, Henning, the floor is yours.
Bedankt, and as you noticed, I'm as old as I look. We heard about justice, and with your permission, I remain seated. I can keep an eye on the watch and on my notes. We heard about justice in the two videos. We heard about development, and I would like to pick up the torch from Annelies with an emphasis on injustice in development studies. That's the context in field which brings us together. And it's a context which is determined by asymmetric power relations. And the point of departure is, if we like it or not, operating in these asymmetric power relations, we tend to be part of the problem and not of the solution, as we sit here. So if we want to become part of the solution, we need to be aware and admit self-critically that the point of departure is we are part of the problem. I'm not saying that to create any guilt complex. It's just, I believe, a realistic assessment of the world in which we operate and are confronted with. And acknowledging that frame allows us to reflect how can we use the system from which we benefit to hopefully undermine it. That's maybe the main and most important challenge. And let me hasten to add that this is a challenge not confined to the global north as the dominant system. The north has since quite some time arrived in the south. The colleagues, the scholars in the south are confronted with the same challenges. We have the same differences between growing poverty and growing richness in the north as it is in the south. We have elites operating in the south, applying the same class system, the same creed as we are confronted with in the north. So it also means we have to acknowledge and cross that divide, which is not any longer such a divide. The dividing lines have changed, they are different. And they also mean we have to re-examine and redefine alliances. You mentioned the term solidarity. It's a very important notion. Which side are we on? And that does not mean that our advocacy means we advocate anything that comes from the south. No. The greedy systems, the state captures in societies of the south are something I take the liberty to criticize. It's the same betrayal of values which I hope we are sharing. And that's solidarity, taking sides with the wretched of the earth. But we operate in a hierarchical system, and a system which applies the power of definition. Neither development nor knowledge is value-free. What do we mean with development? What do we mean with knowledge? Now we have a new trend, which definitely has arrived in the Netherlands as in most other places, which talks about epistemology as a form of decolonization. And I'm all for questioning epistemic violence, but I would like to add a cautious word. That's not an all-encompassing form of decolonization. Let me give you a daily life experience. If you rename Piet Retiefstraat in Kaapstad into Nelson Mandela Avenue, the woman that sells the fat cook there, maybe, but even there I have doubts, maybe feels a bit better because the street name says now Nelson Mandela she can relate to. But it doesn't enhance her business. She is not selling more fat cook because of that. Her material misery is exactly the same. And I'm not ridiculing the name change, but it's just to say that's not good enough. Let me take another example. Roads must fall. I'm always wondering when the students who pass where the monument stood to the upper campus of UCT, if they now score better results in the exams because the monument is removed. My hypothesis is they don't. They might feel better, but they will not most likely have better exams because of that. They would have it because of other factors. And load shedding is definitely not one of the factors. By a greedy elite of state capture, which actually brings students in South Africa into a situation where estimated 1/3 of them need psychological advice because they are not coping with the material deterioration of their environments. So fees must fall as the second initiative. That is closer to how to change the social conditions for students in South Africa. And I use South Africa because I'm very familiar with it. I'm sure there would be other examples somewhere else. I think one of the starting points is not the result of knowledge production, but the process of producing knowledge and the question of ownership. Who owns the knowledge? And this is where our challenge comes in, and I see that my notes are far more than 10 minutes, so I have to skip many of the things. That's the problem when you talk about a subject which is more than just an academic subject, which is part of what you are living and trying to engage with. We need to question who owns the knowledge, but also who produces the knowledge. And this is where we become, in tendency, part of the problem. Because we reproduce a hierarchy where the criteria are set by a system which is not in support of voices from the Global South. It starts with any of you in whichever stage of your career, me not any longer because I'm retired. I can publish wherever I want. I can say whatever I want. Many of you can't. You have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. They are published by a handful of commercial global players, publishing houses. You are not rewarded to disseminate knowledge which you created in true partnership with local partners from the South, with the adequate recognition of them in the local context, in the journals there, in published papers there, in handouts published there, even translated in local languages, to bring back the knowledge created. That's not rewarded. That might be one of the challenges where we need to occupy windows of opportunity to get back to our universities, get back to the Research Council and say, you talk about partnership, but you reproduce a system which undermines true partnership because it remains hierarchical, it remains competitive, and the reward system is totally biased. So these are some of the things to think about, and I have to skip most of the other things. Southerners in research collaboration are not there to implement a Northern agenda as fixers. They deserve better. They deserve recognition, and even if the funding is unfair, they deserve a fair treatment. Fair was another word introduced. Justice means to recognize the partners, practice solidarity, stand up, be aware of the privileges we have, without necessarily feeling guilty, but seeking ways how we can use our privileges to reduce inequalities. And let me end with a quote from a journal of the IDS, the Journal of the Institute for Development Studies, which in an introduction a few years back suggested the following. Development needs to be reframed from narrowly tackling poverty and vulnerability to navigating complex challenges in ways that reduce inequalities and build more sustainable, inclusive, and secure futures for people and societies. We need a universal framing of development that recognizes these challenges as matters for everyone, everywhere, from London to Lagos, from South England to the Sub-Sahara, and from Amsterdam and Brighton, as well as Beijing. And I confess guilty, I have manipulated the quote by inserting Amsterdam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henning. A lot of things for us to think about. Thanks for inviting us to think about the link between the symbolic and the material, and the relationships we build with others in that space as we navigate that space. So thank you very much. I do hope we have time to talk about everything that is on your notes, because I see that you have prepared extensively for this panel, so thank you for that as well. Our last but not least panelist for today is Murat Arsel. Welcome, Murat. Murat is Professor of Political Economy of Sustainable Development at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University Rotterdam. Murat has had previous appointments at University of Cambridge, University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and Universidad San Francisco de Quito. He is also the chair of the editorial board of Development and Change. Situated firmly within development studies and informed by political ecology, heterodox economics, social theory, and agrarian political economy, his work focuses on the tensions between nature, capitalism, and emancipatory socio-economic change. Welcome, Murat. The floor is yours.
And I will stand up because I'm not capable of talking while sitting down. I do have a few slides, so if we can run them, but I will abuse and first, thank you everyone for having me here. And there's obviously a demonstration of justice, injustice, and how justice is not easily compatible across different positionalities built in here. I have so much to say. I could talk for 3 hours, but that probably, and I feel it's unjust that I have only 10 minutes, but at the same time, it would be unjust for you to endure me for 3 hours. So there's a fundamental clash of interest between my interest and your interest. But I will respect the authorities and try to keep myself to 10 minutes. But I will, while...
You prompt me when you want to.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a couple of slides, but I don't use notes. I can't read my handwriting usually, so I don't take notes. So I try to speak to pictures and things. But a couple of things that my fellow panelists said that sort of prodded me to add a few more notes onto what I was hoping to say. And thank you for those wonderful comments. Scholars I read and admire quite a lot, and I am younger than I look. But I feel older than I am, I think. But one of the things I have been doing as an academic, I came to development studies so that you can decipher my age. At the moment, I finished my undergraduate when Arturo Escobar had just published Encountering Development. Yeah, so that's my entry point. That's when I thought, wow, I mean, I was studying more mainstream economics, and then I started reading Escobar and a few other people, and it was like really someone hit me on the head. So that was the moment when I entered development studies. And since then I've been fascinated by the field of development studies as an intellectual endeavor, as an intellectual project, and I published a few things on this. One thing that I'm sort of responding to what you were saying, Professor Zoomers, that there are all these changes, and one thing that I'd like to argue that development studies has always been in crisis. There's no, if you look back, and I'm not going to run the 10 minutes here so I can see how I'm talking, development studies has always been in crisis. Yeah? There's no moment in the last 40, 50 years when development studies scholars have not said, something's wrong with this field. Yeah? We don't know what we're doing. I'll just leave it there. That's point one. Two, and I can come back to it hopefully if someone asks a question about this. I invite you to ask a question about it. The second thing is, you mentioned that development is sort of off the agenda, and other things have come on board, including environmental change. That's in some ways completely true, except that development hasn't really left the agenda of many of the people from developing countries, right? This is precisely why people like Erdogan, Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Trump end up winning elections, because they still promise economic development in a very sort of like 1960s style. That idea has never left the ground. The debates, the policies have moved on, but there's the need for, or the demand for, an old-fashioned understanding of development is very much with us, and it's unlikely to go away. And lastly, poverty. Of course, poverty is global now. We've realized that poverty is not just something that happens up there, it happens here. But I think in the experience of poverty, in its many dimensions, homelessness, lack of food, and all that, must feel the same for those who don't, who experience it. But analytically, I would argue, poverty in the Netherlands, let's say, is not the same thing as poverty in Ecuador, what I want to talk about next. Yeah, they emerge from different dynamics. The experience for the poor might be the same, but as a scholar, I think we need to see them slightly differently. This picture, we can stay here for a second. They say travel broadens the mind, so this is a picture with my colleague Lorenzo Pellegrini. We were traveling in Ecuador. This is Coca in the Ecuadorian Amazon. This is New Coca Airport. We showed up on a weekday, I think, to fly back to Quito. The airport was full, except for the couple of young people there in the front who are most likely tourists. The rest are all men, yeah? Almost all men, all of them working in the oil sector, which prompted me to start thinking, what happens when they all go away? Yeah? One day, we're actually fighting to make them go away. Oil business, and we can move the second slide, oil business is dominant in Ecuador. This is the division of Ecuador's productive matrix in terms of exports last year. About 30% of Ecuadorian earnings come from the oil sector. Yeah, it's huge, and the rest of it is also quite extractive. Most of Ecuadorian economy depends on primary commodity exports. Either you dig the oil out, or gold is becoming much more important, or agro-extractivism. Most of these things are, and we can move to the next slide in the interest of time, most of these things haven't created development. This is a picture from the town of Coca again, old abandoned university building. Most of these extractive processes have not created development in the sense that we would want it, or the people there would want it. And they have created destruction and poverty and misery and all the things that we're fighting against. Yeah, so we want the oil men in the Coca airport to disappear, right? And all this discussion, and I think we can move to the next slide, all this discussion that we're having, especially the question of, again, I have to check my time, in terms of climate change, if we are going to, I think 1 degree, as Joyeeta Gupta said, would be great. I think that train has left. 1.5 is also gone. Maybe one day we can come back. I think if we can limit things to 2, I think we're still okay, right? And to be able to do that, Lorenzo and I and several other colleagues have been publishing, among several other people working on this, studies on how much of the oil, the gas, the coal needs to be left underground. It's, I think, about 30% of the oil, 45% of the gas, 70% of the coal needs to stay unextracted if we are to live within 2 degrees of warming. Yeah? So if we want sustainability at the global level, and if we want sustainability at the Ecuadorian level, at the level of the Amazon, the oil men need to disappear. Yeah, we can't do it, and while having them doing this. So, what happens if the oil men disappear? Well, the oil reserves or oil revenues of Ecuador disappear, and with the disappearing of Ecuadorian oil revenues, poverty and immiseration will only get worse. There's a fantastic study by the IMF, out of all places, that shows that Ecuador was one of the few countries in Latin America who actually had meaningful improvement in poverty reduction from 2000 to 2018 or something like that. The study is very interesting. And this happened precisely because Ecuador was actually exporting more, not less, primary commodities, except that with the right policies, you can actually channel the revenues into poverty reduction and into reducing inequality. So the reserves, the oil reserves under the ground are actually meaningful for Ecuador. If we're telling them not to extract it, if we're asking for all the oil men to disappear, all these improvements are likely to just disappear with them. Next slide. So, no,
sorry.
So I was just thinking about this. This is the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Oriente, those who know it, from Lago Agrio, Nueva Loja, down to Zamora. The urban centers alone have about 200,000 people living in them. The larger region has a population of 1 million. Most of the economic livelihoods today depend on extractive industries. Yeah? Making extractive industries go away, both for local environmental outcomes and for global environmental outcomes, will create profound socioeconomic crises, especially if we are to do this within the next 5-10 years. Final slide. So the question is, the prompt was, think about justice implications. So much of what we're doing are focused on the current moment, right? How to deal with climate change, how to reduce poverty. I think it would be important for us to also think what comes after climate change. Because if we are, we have to prepare. There's that joke about people going to pray and no one takes an umbrella, right? Because you have to prepare to pray for rain. If you don't take an umbrella when you're praying for rain, you're not prepared for what you're asking for. If we are asking for climate change problem to disappear, what happens when we're actually successful? What comes after climate change? Yeah. If you can hit the rest of them, that's my 10-minute prompt. I gave myself 1 more minute. So the question I want to pose, and perhaps we can discuss it today, tomorrow, or next day, is what are the justice implications of renewable energy capitalism on developing countries? Once we move away from fossil capitalism, as Andreas Malm says, and we put something else in place, what does that mean concretely for people in developing countries, concretely to people who live in places like Coca, like Lago Agrio and others? What happens when the oil men go away? If you could just hit everything else, I'll just wrap up. And I want to make 2 sort of like observations on this. One, that development in this case should not be seen simply as poverty reduction. Yeah. Linking to my earlier point about poverty here is not the same thing as poverty there analytically. The response is not simply to make poverty go away, or sorry, this is quite annoying. Yeah. The solution is not simply to make poverty reduction or to even reduce inequality. Development, I think there's an enduring definition, at least coming from Marxist literature, about the development of the means of production, yeah? Unleashing the forces within society, embedded in labor, to create more value, yeah? How that value is created, how it's distributed, what is channeled into, those things are up for debate. But development needs to be seen more than poverty reduction, which means we need to move away, we need to have structural transformation away from the state of affairs in many developing countries. Ecuador is a fantastic example, it's a resource-rich country, but we need to create a different economic logic within Ecuador. In passing, I would argue that going back to sort of farming and hunting, gathering for 1 million people now living in the Ecuadorian Oriente is simply not feasible. So the way forward has to be some sort of industrialization that creates jobs, creates steady employment, creates poverty reduction, creates possibilities. And that necessarily implies economic growth, at least out there. We don't need more economic growth here, but a substantial amount of economic growth to achieve structural transformation, to fulfill the meaning of development, is needed in Ecuador. And the problem is, if we're fixing climate change, we're making the challenge even harder. So there's a fundamental justice implication to fixing the climate change problem without attending to the question of meaningful development in places that are still poor according to various measurements. I'll leave it there, and sorry for taking so long.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murat. thank you for bringing us full circle, because we started with Joyeeta talking about the need for reducing emissions, and you're inviting us to think what happens when if and when we succeed in doing that, right? What are the just implications of that, and taking us into the future of development in that space as well, which is what we are going to be talking about for the next days. I am aware of time, but I do think we should have a moment for at least a couple of questions, so I can move around with the microphone, and you can stay here with that microphone, and that should work. So let's see if we have.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, yes.
The logic of our program is,
Yes.
of course, that after the break we will have.
Oh, sorry, thanks. With a work cafe structure, and the point is we will then in groups, not only restricted to, but also to discuss points that are raised and so on. Of course, the speakers will also join the various discussion rounds. Therefore, we have not planned so much time for Q&A, but whatever said on stage should not just be forgotten, of course, when we do the World Cup later.
Thank you, Maggie, for the very important reminder. We did start 10 minutes late though, so I'm going to allow myself to keep this panel going for 10 more minutes. And we do have a few hands raised, so I'm going to start with Phoebe here. Yes.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the input. I'm a professor from the University of the Philippines, and I teach development studies for the third world. So it's funny, I have a South and South-South dialogue, but today maybe I can experience a North-South dialogue with you. Just a short question, when we speak of colonialism, settler colonialism is over, but for us in the Global South, colonialism has not been over the way Professor Murat discussed about extractivism, but there's a new form of colonialism, which is not actual settlement of the Global North and the Global South. Global North has precision mathematics, DSI, or digital sequence information, which is being used in genomic editing, and so we are experiencing biocolonialism. The same thing that is being experienced in Senegal with Biofuel Corporation. You have corporate impunity, which is triggered by precision mathematics from the Global South. And then we speak of epistemic justice. But which should come first? Epistemic justice or social solidarity that is founded on genuine assets reforms and genuine assets redistribution from Global North to Global South. The same question goes to the issue of poverty in the Global North. How do you speak of genuine assets reforms and genuine assets redistribution from the rich peoples of the Global North to the poor peoples in the Global North? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that on? You can, yes, please, Henning.
I'm very grateful for that. Of course, colonialism is not over. That's just stupid to say that. It lives on in the mindsets in the South, or even among those who claim to have decolonized. They are the colonizers of today in the Global South. And of course, in material terms, it lives on in the economic terms of trade and the exchange patterns. The Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani once said a bit flippantly in a panel debate, but I still quote it all the time. He said, the only post-colonial I know is the post office. And he makes a point. And closer to your home, Ashish Nandi, who was one of those who contributed to post-colonial theory, he wrote a book on the intimate enemy. How the mindset of the North is reproduced among the elite in the South. They continue the same project, and that is a colonial project.
Thank you, Henning. We have one more. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. A very stimulating conversation. I would like to bring in between from Joyeeta to all that you said. Basically, I'm a practitioner and the ambassador of Bangladesh here in the Netherlands. Three things which should connect imminently to you. Because in theory is one thing, but when it goes to places like Geneva, Paris, or New York, it's a completely different ballgame altogether. One is, I was having a conversation with Jan Peter Balkenende, and he said about looking into the new world, when he goes to Club of Madrid, for example, can we have a common agenda? And I said, is it a common agenda or a shared agenda? Why shared? Because when we saw for 2.5 years the drafting of the Agenda 2030 and SDGs, essentially the summary was shared prosperity through shared responsibility. Question and issue is, where is responsibility? I will not explain because I think that's where the crux is, that all that I'm listening to. I give a very crude example. For 10 years, Bangladesh was suffering, we had an industrial accident called Rana Plaza. Then we were moving from Brussels to Paris. And at one time, when we went to OECD in Paris, we were introduced to the EADI guidelines of OECD. And this I should really provoke everyone, and also Professor from Philippines. Because when we said about this is the EADI guidelines for the global corporates, from extractive industry to manufacturing industry, we were told this is voluntary. And I request every one of you to go there. Because you don't have any handle to impose or suggest, forget about compensation, any degree of responsibility on this. And then we had conversations with Germany, France, and all the national contact points of the manufacturers. And I'm sorry, we don't have that. This is one of the crux. So today, when we are going to due diligence, when we are going to ESG and all of this, a big question is coming. Where are we going to determine how the responsibility of profit? And so when I get very amused when I hear about new business models, not to go into anything, that where and how, and what would it lend to the whole landscape of inequality, not to break down. The last point is that technology. When I came 2.5 years back, His Majesty the King told us, "Do you know that the Dutch economy will go circular?" I was very enthused. By 2030, 50%, 2050, 100%. Question and issue, as I ask everyone, from Delft to Eindhoven to Amsterdam, if you're talking of global circularity across global manufacturing, global supply chains, meaning that consumer brands at this end will be ready, they are getting ready. But do we realize across Asia, from Philippines to Bangladesh, India, manufacturers don't know what is circularity. So 2030 is just tomorrow. Everyone asks, where does it lie? Technology. Technology is already developed, but we are really getting afraid we might have a far greater, impactful, and deep divide in terms of technology moving to circular economy. Thank you.
Yes, Annelies, please.
It's risky to take the mic, but what you are referring to is indeed the type of development as being framed in a neoliberal sense, and that indeed if you have investments, you can make investments responsible, and you talk about guidelines. But maybe the general issue that I would like to raise, and which also has to do with your topic, is talking about development. I agree with many things that you said. Also, we should not compare poverty here and there, etc. But what we are looking at is a type of development where investors determine in what direction we go. And to the extent that there is a debate about development or doing good, it is a very limited debate about do not harm, etc. Or at best, how to, what kind of benefit sharing can you do? But it's not about profit sharing and more fundamental issues, etc. And what I try to say in my talk is, thinking about development studies, I'm very much in favor of a kind of against top-down approaches, where projects are being promoted from the outside without inviting people, also in Ecuador, to think about their own futures. And rather than letting investors in or out, or enforcing them to close down the mining, you should maybe be open for people thinking about their future, and then have a debate about, okay, what kind of investment do we need? Which is very different from how it is now. So I'm more radical, I think, than sound, but I think, yeah, the investment-driven world where we are living in is creating problems, etc. And that is when I say it would be good to bring in the human dimension a little bit more, but then in a less narrow sense than we used to do. So not only putting people in the middle, but it is then people and the environment and the animals and the rivers, etc. But it should start there. And maybe also acknowledge that we have people in areas that you can maybe better leave from, looking at the longer term. But start a debate there about the future. What kind of future do we want? And the rest will come later. So that's a little bit where I see development studies, that to break open those kinds of debates. And of course, poverty in the Netherlands, what I mentioned it because I find it interesting to realize that the knowledge, not so much that we generated as academics, but as people living in difficult circumstances, we can learn a lot from them. From people in Bangladesh, how to deal with floods, etc. In the Netherlands, people wait for the government to say, okay, now you have to leave your house. So in that respect, I try to break also our hegemonic attitude, etc. And so I see a role there for us as development studies. I don't know whether we are in crisis all the time. All the disciplines are in crisis, I think. But to start with the core question, what kind of future do we see, given the diversity, given the pressures that we are under? So for me then, thinking about mining, etc., there are many people in Ecuador who were displaced because of mining, etc. So they are not so, they might be happy and get back. No, the mining place is already destroyed now. But it is also a model that has so many different dimensions. So on the one hand, you have a group of people who benefit from it, and who work there, who are often not of those places, but who come in. But I think the complexity of the issue is sometimes also killing us, because where to start if it is so complex? But we are brave and we continue. Yeah?
On that wonderful note, oh yes, who will get? Oh, now I feel like I cannot just stop this conversation.
I mean, I'd love to continue. I will just limit myself to the remarks there, and then we can
take a break.
Mostly, I mean, I'm just chiming in to agree with you for most of what you said. I think there's a fundamental. The problem is not simply investment, right? I mean, we're going to need investment for Ecuador, for Bangladesh, I'm from Cyprus, I was born in Libya, so, these places, for them to develop, it cannot happen completely organically. We're going to need movement of capital. Sure. So the problem is not the movement of capital as such, it's the rules in which capital moves. And the rules and pollution goes to Bangladesh, pollution goes to Ecuador, destructive mining practices endure in Ecuador. Shell operates differently here, even though in Groningen they're not particularly good, than they did in Nigeria. These things are not accidental, these things are by design. The rules of the game are such that certain capital and capital from certain places is given immunity through legal structures by design. So until we can actually address, so the question is not simply profit sharing. The problem, the challenge is to actually create a just, going back to the theme of the conference, a just mechanism in which capital is held responsible. When something happens somewhere else, capital is responsible, and we don't have all these arcane legal structures that protect investors and essentially abandon people who are left at the front lines of mining and oil and all that. I think that's the fundamental change. Climate change, sustain, all these things are fundamentally, at this point, not accidental. They are happening, they are replicated by design. Circular economy is the same thing. It creates a smoke screen within Europe that we're doing something, but it can only happen if we do destructive things somewhere out there. In that sense, it's not the term, it's not the technology, it's the infrastructure, the legal, political, policy infrastructure in which capital moves around the world. We need to address that. Until
we do that. Whether you call it sustainable development or circular economy, ecological modernization, degrowth, it doesn't matter. We need to address the fundamental imbalance of power between different countries around the world.
Thank you very much, Murat. I am very, very sorry for stopping this conversation because it's so thought-provoking and rich, but we do need to organize for our next event. So I'm going to invite you all, this is just pausing this conversation, it's not ending the conversation. We do have coffee at the back of the room, so please help yourselves. We are going to be back in 15-20 minutes for our World Cafe organized by Krelis. I don't know if you want to say something.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just an instruction, so we need to reorganize the tables a bit, so if you could indeed go get some coffee, and if the students could come and help reorganize the tables.
Yes, we can start 4:15, but please join me once again to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you.